Hey, welcome to Ask Jimmy the Dean. Today we're looking at the question, how do I break a habit? Or maybe better put, why is it so hard to break a habit? Let's dive in. First, I want you to know that we're going to address this from what I would call a neurobiology. We're going to take some time to look at what actually happens in the brain as we begin to develop a habit, right? But there's also other ways to approach it as well, and maybe later in this episode or in a part two, we'll talk about the spirituality dimensions, what we've learned in regards to habits when it comes to that. But let's just get back to the question, why is it hard to break a habit? First of all, a habit is something that starts in the mind, usually as an idea, right? And then that idea becomes a belief or something we want, right? Then that belief becomes an action, which becomes a habit, which becomes our character. So some of you might be watching this and thinking, I don't like my character, or I do like my character. In other words, character is the positive or negative. The habit's the thing that leads us to our character. So all that to say, an idea becomes a belief, becomes an action, which becomes a habit. So we oftentimes are sitting there and we realize that all of this runs on something we call neurological pathways. They're the parts in our brain that run between the cognitive, where we're thinking through ideas, and the actual praxis parts of our brains. And those pathways love to get fed by oxygen, right? So anything that you spend a lot of time thinking on, that particular neurological pathway will claim more and more and more energy. And in other words, it's going to demand a certain amount of oxygen and energy being pumped to it. And believe it or not, that just then reinforces the habit further. So the real thing is, what do we do when we put a stake in the ground and we decide we want to break a habit? So in order to bring this home in a picture form, I'll remind you of something I used one other time when we were talking. And it's the above ground swimming pool that my dad had in the backyard growing up. Only 16 foot wide. How he kept that active with 4 boys tearing it apart all summer long, I don't know. But one of our favorite activities was to make a whirlpool. If you ever do this, one of those above ground swimming pools, you can get it going to the point. My brothers and I and a couple neighborhood friends, we got it to the point where that center of that pool would actually start to dip down because we were moving so fast. And then there's that glorious moment where someone yells, turn around, and right, and everyone turns around, and you can't help but giggle and laugh at that early force that you feel when you're getting hit by the currents that whirlpool has created. And that is a lot of what goes on when you decide to turn around and try to break an addictive cycle, which we're referring in this as the whirlpool, right? So first thing you have to realize is that there is this thing called a pit of passion that you face. There is literally, when you decide to break a habit, when you decide to imagine a better place for yourself, something triggers dopamine and serotonin in your brain to make you passionate enough to actually do the turn. So that is called a passion, meaning you get passionate about the new self, you turn in the whirlpool, but then you get hit with all the early forces. And believe it or not, as hard as those forces are, just like the giggle in the whirlpool that I described when a bunch of friends decided to turn around and break it, there is a certain excitement that you're going to tackle this thing. So your brain's firing just enough dopamine and serotonin to get you to have some level of excitement about turning around. Now, we'll get into spiritual dynamics that can jump on board into this as well. But all that to say, there is something called a passion that takes place when you decide to break a habit. So you better be ready for pretty quickly something called the pit of passion to hit. When that serotonin and that dopamine associated with the early desire for a future better self, to live your best life in going forward, to deal with your ego self, all of that wears off naturally. The brain literally will give you a boost to get you catalyzed into something, but you hit something called a pit of passion pretty quick. And secondly, then, your brain doesn't want to be retrained. Now, this is very neurobiological, but your brain loves those pathways, those neural pathways that were fed so much that it desires to make sure they're fed again. So you end up getting something, it's about the same time that the pit of passion's dipping in, something called illusory fatigue sits in. And illusory fatigue is a clinical term where your actual brain tries to dupe you into the fact that you're already tired of this future hope, or you're already tired of these new practices you've been attempting to do. Now, you're not actually tired. It's a self-defense mechanism, the brain, to make sure that which received hyperoxygenation in the past and received a lot of stimulation down neural pathways in the past gets fed more. It is not meant to derail you. You can attach spiritual language to it if you want, but we do, and maybe there is. We can talk about the spirituality aspects of this, but really clearly we've been able to identify in neuroscience, neurobiology, that there is something where the brain wants to make sure those pathways get fed, and it's called illusory fatigue. So it might have to do with the fact that you want to break a new habit, and just about the time you do the actual activities it takes to begin to break it, your brain will actually say something like, we're tired right now, let's just sit this one out. And believe it or not, that coupled with the pit of passion, illusory fatigue hits, and you tend to not get through those early days and weeks after you've decided to break a habit. Now that said, that's what's going on in your brain. It loves you. Let's be patient with ourselves. Our brain is simply trying to make sure that we get what we always wanted before. It's not just some wild lunatic after craving dopamine and serotonin shooting. It literally is just defending previous neurological pathways that were put there. So be gentle with yourself. Be gentle with your brain and what it's doing to you in those moments. And this is when it becomes critical to get a community around you, because a community around you in those early steps is one of the quickest ways to get through that. Now, in part 2 of this, I'm going to go into some of the spiritual dimensions that might be at work. And I'm also going to give you 3 tricks, 3 proven techniques to get through the pit of passion and the fatigue, illusory fatigue that can set in. So there's a little bit about what's going on inside of you, and I hope the best for you. Habits can be broken, and you, your friends, your family systems, it's a lot of hope that's out there, and let's tackle this stuff. If you're interested in knowing more, rate Jimmy the Dean /ask, and you can ask any question you want, or /subscribe, and keep track of what we're up to. Hope to see you soon for part 2.